Let me tell you a story. It's got drama, trauma, and plot twists worthy of any Netflix series. Except this doesn't come with a pause button or a skip button. This is real. It's a story of a girl born into abandonment. The woman who birthed her passed away the day she was born. The man who brought her into this world chose to leave her behind. But someone else chose her, the girl's maternal grandparents, along with their daughter and son in law, who had just become parents themselves. And they said yes to another child, not by birth, but by love. And so, in a home where grief and grace coexisted, a new family was stitched together, not because of conception, but because of bravery. She would lose that mother at the age of 12, this time to a road traffic accident, and her grandfather at 15, and her grandmother at 16. A home where families were living with grace and happiness. She didn't know how to proceed. The home which chose her, she began to feel like an outsider in the same home. She did not realize until much later the entire story of her life until they were gone. The family who chose her now made her feel like she didn't belong. And she began to journey within herself, and she realized that love was fleeting, people disappeared, and her anger was somehow unwelcome. She didn't know that this was a home where she was bullied because of the color of her skin, because she was called fat and ugly, and even blamed for her biological mother's death. At the family events, she was not even acknowledged as the daughter of those who chose to raise her, but constantly reminded that she was the child of those who abandoned her. She began to wonder, what did I do so wrong to deserve this life? Grief was like a journey of trickery. It had its ups and downs, it came and went like waves. But she constantly reminded, and she heard in her ears somebody's voices of her mother and her grandparents who kept telling her, no matter what anyone takes away from you, knowledge is something no one can ever take. So she held on. She kept striving, working multiple jobs, always trying to prove her worth, feeling like nothing she ever did was enough. She got married, she was elated, but she missed them fiercely. When she earned her doctorate, she remembered how they acknowledged her even when she barely spoke English. She realized that she slowly began understanding the power of reparenting. She carried them wherever she went. She remembered they lived through her, not because somebody says they're watching you by giving false hopes to her. But most importantly, she realized she became the witness to the power of reparenting. She understood that the healing continues to move forward and it's not a linear process. Today, that girl stands before you as a daughter, a sister, a spouse, a psychologist, and a trauma researcher. My name is Ashwini Govinda, and this is my story. While I began to wonder, what is trauma really? A famous Canadian physician and someone who's immensely put his energy to work on trauma spoke about how trauma isn't what happens to you, it's about what happens inside of you. It stores in your body somatically. It leaves imprints not just emotionally, but neurologically, biologically, and even genetically. So, what happens to us doesn't disappear. It gets stored in our body and it gets in the pathways of our nervous system, in our choices, in our relationships. So, one of the most cited studies globally is on adverse childhood experiences. There is a constant talk about in the research world that the childhood trauma experiences has a very high impact on the kind of experiences an individual would have later in their life. And it would be very drastic. And most individuals experience several diseases and disorders, from diseases such as heart disease, cardiovascular and kidney diseases, and several things, and to even depression, substance abuse, and job instability. If children are not provided with emotional needs from the ages of 0 to 18, their life is not going to look very pretty when they grow up. There's a high risk for dysfunction as they grow up. And this isn't just theory, this is biology. Intergenerational trauma can be transmitted unless interrupted. But here's the good news. While I kept wondering how come there are so many individuals who've experienced trauma, but how come they're still functioning? How am I still here? How am I still working as a psychologist? That's when I realized healing too can be passed on. There's a lot of research on intergenerational trauma, but not so famous in India, which made me wonder and made me more ambitious and stubborn enough to take this up in my doctoral research. And I realized trauma isn't just violence, it's not just neglect, it's about the meaning our nervous system assigns to the overwhelming experiences that we carry. It gets encoded in our body when we're too young to name it. It's often what didn't happen to us, like the love that wasn't felt, safety that wasn't there, and the apology that never came. It's the consistency that wasn't offered. So, what does a person with childhood trauma look like? Anyone? Maybe someone you already know? Maybe like me? Maybe even like you? So, why does parenting and people in our life matter so much, especially in the context of trauma? While I began to wonder how my mother didn't carry me in her womb, there was this idea that I formed that I'm an adopted child. People kept treating me differently, like other than my sibling. I want to reimagine the word adoptive with all of you today. I want to call it parented by choice, love that outlives the DNA, just simply because there's so much stigma and taboo associated with the word adoption and adoptive parents and adopted children. So there's sibling rivalry in all homes, right? You experience, I've experienced. But my sister, since the day I was brought home, she protected me fiercely, even though we didn't share the same womb. This is because the kind of power of parenting that we both experienced, not from the world, but because of our grandparents and our parents who chose calm and grace even when there was so much chaos. So, my research on trauma, we kept working with individuals who've experienced trauma, who've been survivors of trauma. We understood that most individuals believe that their trauma can be passed on, that they believe that they don't have control over what happens to their children. But what we noticed in the intervention study that we had was that most individuals who said a maybe when when I asked them whether you want to be a parent in the future, they said a maybe. They said, I don't know. Let me see what happens. It's too soon to say. But the results were really fascinating after 6 weeks of intervention. They became more confident, they experienced more self compassion, they even chose the path of conscious parenting when they said a maybe 6 weeks before. So, there were two clinical models that came up from this research. I'm going to simplify it and talk about how, when there is trauma, there is survival. So, whenever we are experiencing the residual effects of trauma, we come back to the survival mode unknowingly. There's fight or flight without even we knowing. But most often, most of these individuals mentioned that they're surviving, but they also want to thrive. They aspire to thrive. On the other hand, after 6 weeks of intervention, what we noticed was they moved from fight or flight, which is survival, to understanding that they can reparent, and they began reparenting by meeting the unmet needs of their own inner child. And then they began to understand and believe how they can really thrive to become really better parents for their own children in the future. And like I said, this isn't just theory, right? This is something which is studied over and over again through neurology, through neuropsychology, and through brain studies. So, what exactly is reparenting revolution? And why am I so fascinated about it? So, even before you explore what kind of parenting style you want to choose for yourself, you probably need to reparent that one child who's been abandoned, who didn't feel the love, who didn't receive certain things when they were growing up. And guess who that child is? It's your inner child. In my therapy rooms, while I continue to talk to clients, I keep seeing certain patterns that the adults who are struggling the most aren't the bad parents. It's the child inside them who's still struggling, who's still craving for the attention and love they didn't receive. What if parenting begins with how we've been reparented and we've reparented ourselves? So, reparenting isn't optional, it's necessary. While I began to understand that I'm going through a journey of healing, I did everything possible. I went through therapy, I still am in therapy, I continue to work probably in spirituality, in yoga, and multiple different aspects of healing. But then I got married and I realized a complete topsy turvy of my internal world, not because my spouse didn't understand what I was going through, but intimate relationships trigger our deepest wounds. My spouse used to sit with me even when I was angry, when I was anxious, even when I was avoidant, but he gave me the space not by judging me, not by saying I'm too much, but by just being there in silence, even though certain times he probably didn't understand my world, my internal world. So, intimate partners can trigger our wounds, but they can also trigger our deepest healing. So, why does reparenting matter so much? Trauma has a way of echoing in our bones. It shows up in our relationships, in the way we trust, in how we feel safe, and how we don't. So, reparenting, it's not about fixing our past. It's not about perfection. It's about finally offering ourselves the presence and the parenting we've deserved all along. Every time you show up with softness instead of self criticism, you're already reparenting. So, when I began to wonder, there is reparenting, but then there's also parenting. There's so many different styles of parenting, so many kinds of parenting, which we keep talking about, but predominantly there are four different styles of parenting. There is something called as conscious parenting, which really begins to change the world and how we see our children and how we see ourselves. So, like I said, my mother didn't carry me in her womb. I began to realize most parents and most families these days, they've told me, what if I don't want to be a parent? What if I don't want to carry a child? But here's the good news, you don't have to be a parent to be a parent. You can choose to remain child free, and it honestly deserves deepest respect. Imagine how you can still be an influencer to children around you. You can be a role model, you can be an aunt and an uncle, you can be a neighbor, you can be several things, but there are children around you watching you. And there's a lot of study on neuroplasticity and how our brain rewires itself and reorganizes our consequences of our past, but the past is still there. The way we respond to it changes. And that's what is neuroplasticity. And that's how the neuro pathways changes once we start reparenting. Reparenting yourself transforms in how you show up for yourself and how you show up for others. So, how do we begin? How do we meet our inner child? Most often, when we use the word inner child, it sounds very abstract. It sounds like this is all made up. Let me give you a small imaginative exercise. As soon as you go home today, take a second, close your eyes, and think of one childhood memory. Whatever comes to your mind, that's absolutely fine. And that's the beginning of your inner child story. That's where, that's a good start. That's where you begin to ask this child, what can I do for you? I am here right now. You probably won't know the amount of love I have for you, and you would probably begin to learn how much I have to offer. That's the start. So, healing isn't personal, it's cultural. It's like I've called something um, of this as a stingy phenomenon. It's like peeling the layers of onion. It becomes very stingy, you start tearing up, it's messy, and eventually you'll start to begin to understand how this is what you need. The depths of what you have experienced can be changed, and that is what is healing. I never use the word healed because that stops the growth. That's a stagnation of growth. Love yourself before you love others. This is something that we've been taught, right? Sounds really nice, but can we really do it? We've not been taught to love ourselves. How can we offer ourselves to others? But it's actually true. We can actually offer ourselves to others and not so much to ourselves because it sounds very selfish. It sounds too needy. Reparenting, like I said, is not about perfection. It's about pausing, choosing again, and saying, "This ends with me." We break patterns not through force, but through awareness. And that is what happens in reparenting. So let's come home to ourselves. You are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become. So I'd like to invite you and welcome you to this reparenting revolution, one breath, one choice, one moment at a time. Thank you for beginning this journey with me.